Have you ever wondered why people who grew up in the 1960s often carry such strong convictions, yet also a deep emotional complexity? There's something distinct about them, a mix of idealism and realism, rebellion and discipline, hope and skepticism. It's not random, it's psychological. Because growing up in the 1960s meant forming your identity during one of the most turbulent decades in modern history. The 1960s were not quiet. They were loud, political, emotional, and transformative. Civil rights marches filled the streets. The Vietnam War dominated headlines. The Cold War created constant background anxiety. Leaders were assassinated. Authority was openly questioned. And at the same time, humanity landed on the moon. Imagine being a child or teenager during that decade. Your brain is still forming. Your sense of right and wrong is still developing. And the world around you is debating morality, justice, and power in real time. That kind of environment doesn't just create memories. It shapes neural pathways. Developmental psychology shows that adolescence is one of the most critical periods for identity formation. During those years, the brain becomes hypersensitive to social values and moral frameworks. When those frameworks are unstable or evolving, the mind becomes more analytical, more questioning, more aware of systems. This is one reason many people who grew up in the 1960s developed strong personal beliefs. They didn't grow up in a passive cultural climate. They grew up watching society argue about what was right and what was wrong. That kind of exposure builds moral engagement. It forces young minds to choose positions. At the same time, the 1960s were deeply uncertain. The threat of nuclear war was not abstract, it was discussed in classrooms. Families had real conversations about survival. When children grow up with existential uncertainty in the background, their stress systems calibrate differently. Not necessarily traumatized, but vigilant. Psychologists call this ambient threat conditioning. Even when danger isn't immediate, constant exposure to threat narratives changes how the brain assesses risk. It can produce adults who are cautious, politically aware, and sensitive to global instability. But here's the contrast. The 1960s were also culturally explosive. Music transformed. Fashion broke norms. Art challenged tradition. Young people were told they could question authority. That combination, fear of global conflict paired with social liberation, creates a powerful psychological tension. It builds people who believe change is possible, but who also know change is costly. There's also the matter of authority. The 1960s saw institutions challenged openly. Governments were criticized. Social hierarchies were confronted. When children witness authority being questioned at a societal level, their brains develop what researchers call a critical orientation. They don't automatically reject authority, but they don't blindly accept it either. This is why many people raised in the 1960s value independence of thought. They may distrust propaganda. They may analyze media carefully. They often appreciate debate because they grew up during a decade where questioning wasn't rebellion, it was survival. Family dynamics during that time also played a role. Many households were still structured traditionally, while culture outside was rapidly shifting. That tension created an internal negotiation. Obedience at home, revolution in the streets. That duality can produce adults who are outwardly composed but internally passionate. And then there's the emotional imprint of collective events. When major historical moments occurred during adolescence, like the moon landing or a political assassination, they bind deeply to identity. The brain encodes those events with high emotional intensity. People who grew up in the 1960s don't just remember those moments, they feel them. They experienced history as something immediate and personal. That creates a lifelong sense of generational identity, a feeling that we lived through something, But resilience formed in that decade too. Despite protests and upheaval, daily life continued. School, friendships, routines, that mix of disruption and normalcy builds adaptability. The brain learns to function amid uncertainty. It doesn't collapse, it recalibrates. However, there's a shadow side. Growing up in constant ideological conflict can lead to polarization in adulthood. Strong beliefs can harden into rigid beliefs. Skepticism can slide into distrust. Passion can become frustration when progress feels slow. Many who grew up in the 1960s display remarkable perseverance. They witnessed transformation. They saw laws change. They saw cultural barriers fall. That lived experience reinforces a belief that progress, even imperfect progress, is possible. If you grew up in the 1960s, you might recognize this in yourself. The intensity of your opinions, the emotional reaction to certain songs, the instinct to question, the ability to endure social tension without panic. If you didn't grow up in that era, you might better understand why that generation carries both fire and fatigue, idealism and realism, hope and caution. The real psychology of people who grew up in the 1960s isn't rebellion. It isn't nostalgia. It isn't even skepticism. It's awakening. They came of age during a decade that forced awareness. Awareness of injustice, awareness of power, awareness of global risk, and awareness changes a brain permanently. But here's the empowering truth. No brain is frozen in time. The neural architecture shaped in the 1960s can evolve. Idealism can mature into wisdom. Skepticism can refine into discernment. Passion can soften into guidance. Your childhood built the framework, but you are still writing the structure. And maybe that's the lasting psychological legacy of the 1960s. Not just protest, not just revolution, but consciousness.